Welcome to part 2 of a series where I review books released every month of the year 2024. For books released in January, February and March, you can check my previous video here, which means today we are tackling books released in April, May and June. For the month of April, I chose to read Cranberry, Cove by Hailey Piper. This was published by Bad Hand Books, and this time around I went for the ebook version. I purchased it and I chose this because I wasn't sure I was going to like it, and this was essentially much cheaper. That turned out to be a good idea because unfortunately I didn't love this book. I also didn't dislike it. In fact, my main problem with it is that it wasn't very memorable, which also means I don't have that much to say about it. I guess I'll start by saying what it's about. The story revolves around the Cranberry Cove Hotel, which has now been abandoned for years, and it is kind of widely known that there is something weird going in there and it may be haunted. However, it's curious because it turns out that the victims of whatever entity inhabits the hotel are always men, and they're always attacked in a very particular way. Or at least that's what we know, because most of them, or almost all of them, have gone missing after. They never come out. But there is one survivor that lived to tell the experience of what happened to him. This survivor turns out to be the son of a criminal kingpin, kind of like the head of a mob or something like that. And he has sent his investigators / enforcers to figure out what was happening and basically get justice for what happened to his son. So that's the setup of the story, and we just follow these investigators as they work together to figure out what was happening in the hotel. What I did like about the book is the main characters. I think I expected this from Hailey Piper from the only other book I've read of hers, which is The Worm and His Kings, but they came across as very real and very complex and also really endearing. It is also very interesting because these investigators are one man and one trans woman. And he's known her before her transition, and so did the boss, like the criminal kingpin. So it gives very interesting insight about how this was for all of them. And of course, this ties back to the fact that the thing in the hotel attacks only men. So I think somewhere in the story, there was some substance regarding gender identity and gender roles, but I don't think it was fully realized. Unless I didn't get it, which is also a possibility. I was definitely very intrigued by the premise of the story and the fact that it is, I would say, correctly described as a supernatural crime thriller. I do love the intersection between crime investigation and the supernatural, and I do think the setup of the mystery was incredibly well presented. As I said, I was compelled by the characters. I was curious about what was going on in the hotel. I loved to be teased about the fact that it probably was supernatural, but then I felt that the story kind of ran out of steam and didn't really tie up any of the threads in the story. And if you know me, you know I am a big fan of open or ambiguous endings, but that only works if there is enough tension across the whole story so that the open ending actually leaves you feeling intrigued or confused or annoyed. But when I was coming to the end of this story, my interest was waning quite a lot, so the lack of resolution just left me like hanging a little bit. I think I gave it 3 stars because, as I said, the setup was really cool and the writing wasn't bad. Hailey Piper's writing style is very nice and easy to read, but I don't know, it was just underwhelming, I guess. Let's move on to the new release for the month of May, which just happens to be one of, if not my most anticipated release for the year. And I really can't hold back anymore. It was a 5-star. And that book is Rotten Tommy by David Sodergren. As I said, this was published in May and it's fully self-published. David publishes his books under the banner, let's say, of Paperbacks and Pugs. There you go. And what can I say about this except David has done it again? As you might recall, I absolutely loved his previous two releases, which were Maggie's Grave and The Heart. I will link my review for those two books somewhere around here, so you can go and watch them if you haven't. So, as excited as I was about this, I was also a tiny bit nervous because I feel like it must be really hard to live up to the expectations time and time again. So I'm really happy that this worked for me. But I do want to talk about it a little bit because I have a feeling that it may not work as well for everyone. In this one, we follow Becky, a woman who one day finds a set of VHS tapes hidden in the walls of her house, which is also the house that she grew up in. And disturbingly, the contents of the VHS tapes, once she manages to get them converted, etc., they seem to somehow relate to her mom's disappearance, which happened when she was a little kid. So the story kicks off not only with a really enticing mystery, but a very creepy videotape. So the story lands squarely in that cursed media type of storyline. I don't want to describe what's in the tapes too much, but what makes it extra creepy is that it's an old, lost kids TV show. So there's a really strange mix of things that obviously were meant for children, but have gone somehow wrong. So I was hooked right from the start. It really reminded me of things like The Ring, which is one of my favorite horror movies ever. So we could say that from very early on, I was very invested in the story. So what starts as a somewhat quiet, eerie horror story quickly devolves into the bizarre, full-on bizarre territory, and things get really terrifying and violent when one specific character from that TV show seems to have sneaked into the real world, and that character obviously is Rotten Tommy. This book is also very faithful to Sodergren's ultra-violent writing style. I wouldn't say it's extreme because everything comes across somewhat lighthearted, even though there's a lot of blood and gore and a bunch of horrible deaths. But because the author is so good at interweaving the violence with action, comedy, as usual, he has a main character that we are really rooting for, that comes across very relatable and likable. So despite the violence, it ends up being a somewhat light read. What I love about Sodergren's books as well is they can be dressed up or down. What I mean by that is that if you're in the mood for some light, fun, even trashy style book, this will work. But if you're also looking for a solid horror novel, this will work as well. Now, the key thing to know if you're going to enjoy this book or not is that you have to fully embrace the weirdness. You have to be okay with not knowing exactly why everything works the way it works. There are plenty of things that are left unexplained, but that didn't bother me because I could just accept that this was a whole different world with whole different rules and not something we could ever comprehend. So I was fine with it, but if you don't like that feeling, maybe you will find this too strange. I don't want to reveal much more plot-wise. I'll just say that up to about 75% of the book, this was a solid 4-star read for me. However, in the last quarter, maybe even less than that, maybe the last 15% when the story is kind of wrapping up, I found the resolution so heart-wrenching, so surprising, mind-blowing, and I don't know how else to describe it, but in general, so fitting for the story and the characters that ending just pushed the book to a 5-star for me. I think my favorite Sodergren is still The Heart, but now this is second place. So especially if you like weird, bizarre, wacky horror, I highly recommend that you check this out. Finally, we move into the June release. I know I said this video would come out faster than the previous episode, and I think I may have failed to keep that promise, so apologies for that. But I'm really trying my best. With no further ado, the June release I chose was Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker-Martin, which is about a group of queer kids that get sent basically to a conversion camp. And if this was not already horrifying enough, they find that there is something terrifying lurking in the campgrounds that is looking to take everything from them in a way that it may never be possible for them to go back to being who they really are. There are two timelines in this story, but they are not mixed. So the first timeline is in the 90s when these kids obviously are kids and they get sent to camp. And then there's a later section where they're adults and they basically have to come back together once again to finally once and for all defeat this thing that they barely escaped from. It's kind of like an It situation, and there are definitely some parallels which I think were purposeful. I think the author was paying homage to It by Stephen King. I think this is a book with many flaws that somehow I still managed to enjoy very much. So where shall I start? I think if anything, I felt a little bit shortchanged because the synopsis of the book mentions that this conversion camp is run by religious zealots. I think that's how you pronounce that word. I think I've only ever seen it written down. Anyways, I love stories that may not necessarily be religious horror but explore themes of religious trauma, but we didn't really get much of that in the book. It was mostly just glossed over. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I was just surprised because then when I realized that we're not really getting into this, I was very intrigued about what the actual evil force was going to be, and I'm not going to spoil that for you. I'll just say it leans much more into the cosmic horror, which, as I said, I was honestly pleasantly surprised about it. My favorite part of this book was the prologue. It was banging. It's a very short section of the book, obviously, but it immediately sets a very eerie, very ominous, uncomfortable atmosphere, and there is very good tension building, and then we get a horrifying reveal. And giving that little snippet of information of what is to come, I think is crucial for the book, because that's what will keep you invested while the story is being developed. And that's very much needed because the pacing of this book is very slow. There is a lot of setup and it definitely requires a lot of patience from the reader. But basically it hints that whatever's gonna happen to these kids has already happened before. And it doesn't reveal too much. It reveals just enough for you to be invested in actually going on these kids' journey. So, talking about the kids, probably the main reason why the pacing of the story is so slow is that the cast of characters is huge. I think we follow 7 kids. And I understand that the author wanted to cover the whole spectrum of racial and sexual identities, but in my opinion, it was a little bit too much. Especially because the book is constantly changing perspectives, like paragraph to paragraph. You just follow a different kid and there are no headers to indicate who we're following or anything. So your brain just has to like really quickly switch and infer who we are talking about. And where we're following each character, we not only get their perspective on what's currently happening, but they always go like a stream of consciousness, often meandering through memories of their past, which obviously contribute a lot to their character, but it's just a bit of a whiplash moving between characters and timelines and memories and relationships. And I somewhat enjoyed the confusing feeling that this gave me, but ultimately I'm not sure to what extent it actually serves the story. I must say that I do love the way the author describes not only things but also feelings, emotions, the way characters react to things that happen or have happened to them. And once the thing is revealed, I enjoyed the super detailed descriptions the author gave us. I thought it was very cinematic, although I struggle to imagine how you could represent that in a movie because it's so weird. And it's really interesting because the author kept describing this thing over and over and over again, but always finding new ways to put that imagery in your mind. So I actually really appreciated that aspect, and I think it really amped up the weirdness and the grossness and the horror. Emotionally, I was invested in the story, even though there were too many characters characters, and therefore it was kind of hard to emotionally connect with every single one of them. I think I ended up connecting to them as a group, and for me that worked quite well. They were a group of people that I was really rooting for. I think there is a lot of bleakness in this book. They're all characters that have been through a lot, to the point where it might feel a bit too much. There is not a lot of queer joy. It is a story where this character's suffering is very much on display. However, I do think that towards the end of the book, even if the story definitely does not take a very bright and happy turn, I was able to detect an undercurrent of real appreciation and enjoyment of having the opportunity to just be your true authentic self. So weirdly, even though, as I said, it's very bleak, very sad, there is a cautious, hopeful tone to the book. Yeah, I think that's it, like cautious hopefulness. I think I ended up giving this book either 3.5 or 4 stars. It's definitely not perfect in terms of the delivery of the story, in my opinion, but I think it's worth reading in terms of reading queer stories for starters, and then also for readers who enjoy weird, slightly disgusting stories with emotional impact, and also if you don't mind this kind of like rambly, meandering storytelling style. I think that's it for this episode. If you have read any of the books I mentioned in this video, do let me know what you thought of them, and also let me know what has been your favorite 2024 release so far, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!